Captivity and Flight, Heroism of Thomas Higgins and of Mrs. Pursley, Affairs at Boonesborough, Continued Alarms Need of Saltit's Manufacture Indian Schemes Capture of Boone and 27 Men Dilemma of the British at Detroit Blackfish, Adopts Colonel Boone Adoption's Ceremony Indian Designs Escape of Boone Attacks the Savages the Fort Threatened. The following well-authenticated account of the adventures of a ranger is so graphically described in Brown's History of Illinois that we give it in the words of the writer. Thomas Higgins, a native Kentuckian, was, in the summer of 1814, stationed in a blockhouse 8 miles south of Greenville, in what is now Bond County, Illinois. On the evening of the 30th of August, 1814, a small party of Indians having been seen prowling about the station, Lieutenant Journey, with all his men, 12 only in number, sallied forth the next morning just before daybreak in pursuit of them. They had not proceeded far on the border of the prairie before they were in an ambuscade of 70 or 80 savages. At the first fire, the lieutenant and 3 of his men were killed. 6 fled to the fort under cover of the smoke, for the morning was sultry and the air being damp, the smoke from the guns hung like a cloud over the scene. But Higgins remained behind to have one more pull at the enemy, and to avenge the death of his companions. He sprang behind a small elm scarcely sufficient to protect his body, when the smoke partly rising discovered to him a number of Indians, upon whom he fired and shot down the foremost one. Concealed still by the smoke, Higgins reloaded, mounted his horse, and turned to fly when a voice, apparently from the grass, hailed him with, "Tom, you won't leave me, will you?" He turned immediately around and, seeing a fellow soldier by the name of Burgess lying on the ground, wounded and gasping for breath, replied, "No, I will not leave you, come along." "I can't come," said Burgess, "my leg is all smashed to pieces." Higgins dismounted and, taking up his friend whose ankle had been broken, was about to lift him on his horse when the animal, taking fright, darted off in an instant and left them both behind. "This is too bad," said Higgins, "but don't fear. You hop off on your 3 legs and I will stay behind between you and the Indians and keep them off. Get into the tallest grass and creep as near the ground as possible." Burgess did so and escaped. The smoke which had hitherto concealed Higgins now cleared away, and he resolved, if possible, to retreat. To follow the track of Burgess was most expedient. It would, however, endanger his friend. He determined, therefore, to venture boldly forward, and if discovered, to secure his own safety by the rapidity of his flight. On leaving a small thicket in which he had sought refuge, he discovered a tall, portly savage nearby, and 2 others in the direction between him and the fort. He started, therefore, for a little rivulet near, but found one of his limbs failing him, it having been struck by a ball in the first encounter, of which, till now, he was scarcely conscious. The largest Indian pressed close upon him, and Higgins turned round 2 or 3 times in order to fire. The Indian halted and danced about to prevent his taking aim. He saw that it was unsafe to fire at random, and perceiving 2 others approaching, knew that he must be overpowered unless he could dispose of the forward Indian first. He resolved, therefore, to halt and receive his fire. The Indian raised his rifle, and Higgins, watching his eye, turned suddenly as his finger pressed the trigger and received the ball in his thigh. He fell but rose immediately and ran. The foremost Indian, now certain of his prey, loaded again, and with the other 2 pressed on. They overtook him. He fell again, and as he rose the whole 3 fired, and he received all their balls. He now fell and rose a 3rd time, and the Indians, throwing away their guns, advanced upon him with spears and knives. As he presented his gun at one or another, each fell back. At last the largest Indian, supposing his gun to be empty from his fire having been thus reserved, advanced boldly to the charge. Higgins fired, and the savage fell. He had now 4 bullets in his body, an empty gun in his hand, 2 Indians unharmed as yet before him, and a whole tribe but a few yards distant. Any other man would have despaired, not so with him. He had slain the most dangerous of the 3, and having but little to fear from the others, began to load his rifle. They raised a savage whoop and rushed to the encounter. A bloody conflict now ensued. The Indians stabbed him in several places. Their spears, however, were but thin poles hastily prepared and which bent whenever they struck a rib or a muscle. The wounds they made were not therefore deep, though numerous. At last one of them threw his tomahawk. It struck him upon the cheek, severed his ear, laid bare his skull to the back of his head, and stretched him upon the prairie. The Indians again rushed on, but Higgins, recovering his self-possession, kept them off with his feet and hands. Grasping at length one of their spears, the Indian, in attempting to pull it from him, raised Higgins up, who, taking his rifle, dashed out the brains of the nearest savage. In doing this, however, it broke, the barrel only remaining in his hand. The other Indian, who had heretofore fought with caution, came now manfully into the battle. His character as a warrior was in jeopardy. To have fled from a man thus wounded and disarmed, or to have suffered his victim to escape, would have tarnished his fame forever. Uttering, therefore, a terrific yell, he rushed on and attempted to stab the exhausted ranger. But the latter warded off his blow with one hand and brandished his rifle barrel with the other. The Indian was as yet unharmed, and under existing circumstances by far the most powerful man. Higgins' courage, however, was unexhausted and inexhaustible. The savage at last began to retreat from the glare of his untamed eye to the spot where he had dropped his rifle. Higgins knew that if he recovered that, his own case was desperate. Throwing, therefore, his rifle barrel aside, and drawing his hunting knife, he rushed upon his foe. A desperate strife ensued. Deep gashes were inflicted on both sides. Higgins, fatigued and exhausted by the loss of blood, was no longer a match for the savage. The latter succeeded in throwing his adversary from him and went immediately in pursuit of his rifle. Higgins at the same time rose and sought for the gun of the other Indian. Both, therefore, bleeding and out of breath, were in search of arms to renew the combat. The smoke had now passed away and a large number of Indians were in view. Nothing, it would seem, could now save the gallant ranger. There was, however, an eye to pity and an arm to save, and that arm was a woman's. The little garrison had witnessed the whole combat. It consisted of but 6 men and 1 woman. That woman, however, was a hosta, Mrs. Pursley. When she saw Higgins contending single-handed with a whole tribe of savages, she urged the rangers to attempt his rescue. The rangers objected, as the Indians were 10 to 1. Mrs. Pursley therefore snatched a rifle from her husband's hand, and declaring that so fine a fellow as Tom Higgins should not be lost for want of help, mounted a horse and sallied forth to his rescue. The men, unwilling to be outdone by a woman, followed at full gallop, reached the spot where Higgins had fainted and fell before the Indians came up. And while the savage with whom he had been engaged was looking for his rifle, his friends lifted the wounded ranger up and throwing him across a horse before one of the party reached the fort in safety. Higgins was insensible for several days, and his life was preserved by continued care. His friends extracted 2 of the balls from his thigh. 2, however, yet remained, one of which gave him a good deal of pain. Hearing afterwards that a physician had settled within a day's ride of him, he determined to go and see him. The physician asked him $50 for the operation. This Higgins flatly refused, saying that it was more than half a year's pension. On reaching home, he found that the exercise of riding had made the ball discernible. He requested his wife, therefore, to hand him his razor. With her assistance, he laid open his thigh until the edge of the razor touched the bullet, then, inserting his 2 thumbs into the gash, he flirted it out, as he used to say, without it costing him a cent. The other ball yet remained. It gave him, however, but little pain, and he carried it with him to the grave. Higgins died in Fayette County, Illinois, a few years ago. He was the most perfect specimen of a frontier man in his day, and was once assistant doorkeeper of the House of Representatives in Illinois. The facts above stated are familiar to many to whom Higgins was personally known, and there is no doubt of their correctness. Footnote E. Brown's, Illinois. This narrative gives one a very vivid idea of the nature of the conflict in which Boone, through so many years of his life, was engaged. The little fort, whose feeble garrison he commanded, was liable at any time to be assailed by overwhelming numbers. Daniel Boone, during his occupancy of the fort at Boonesborough, manifested the most constant vigilance to guard against surprise. He was, however, struggling against a foe whose cunning and stratagems were such as not to allow him an hour of quiet. One morning 2 men laboring in the field were shot at by the Indians. Not being hit, they ran for the fort. They were pursued by the savages, and one was tomahawked and scalped within a few hundred feet of the gate. Boone, hearing the alarm, inconsiderately rushed out with 10 men upon the miscreants. They fled before him, hotly pursued. In the eagerness of the chase, Boone had not counted the number of his foes. Some of them, rushing from their ambush, cut off his retreat. At one discharge, 6 of his men fell wounded. Boone's leg was shattered by a ball. As he fell to the ground, the tomahawk of a savage was over his head. Simon Kenton, who was one of Boone's party, with sure aim pierced the heart of the savage with a rifle bullet, and he fell dead. Reinforcements rushed from the fort and fortunately succeeded in rescuing the adventurous party, the wounded and all. It is said of Boone that though a silent man and not given to compliments, he manifested very deep gratitude to his friend Kenton for saving his life. The very peculiar character of Boone is vividly presented in the following sketch, from the graphic pen of Mr. Peck. As dangers thickened and appearances grew more alarming, as scouts came in with rumors of Indians seen here and there, and as the hardy and bold woodsmen sat around their campfires with the loaded rifle at hand, rehearsing for the 20th time the tales of noble daring or the hairbreadth escapes, Boone would sit silent, apparently not heeding the conversation, employed in repairing the rents in his hunting shirt and leggings, molding bullets or cleaning his rifle. Yet the eyes of the garrison were upon him. Concerning Indian signs he was an oracle. Sometimes with 1 or 2 trusty companions, but more frequently alone, as night closed in, he would steal noiselessly away into the woods to reconnoiter the surrounding wilderness. And in the daytime, stealthily would he creep along with his trusty rifle resting on his arm, ready for the least sign of danger. his keen, piercing eyes glancing into every thicket and canebrake, or watch intently for signs of the wily enemy. Accustomed to range the country as a hunter and a scout, he would frequently meet the approaching travelers on the road and pilot them into the settlement, while his rifle supplied them with provisions. He was ever more ready to aid the community or to engage in public services than to attend to his private interests. The want of salt had become one of the greatest privations of the garrison. It was an article essential to comfort and health, and yet in the warfare then existing was almost impossible of attainment. Upon the Sicking River, nearly 100 miles north from Boonesborough, there were valuable springs richly impregnated with salt. Animals from all quarters frequented these springs, licking the saturated clay around them. Hence the name of salt licks. Evaporating the water by boiling in large kettles, salt of a good quality was easily obtained. The necessities of the garrison became so great that Colonel Boone took a well-armed party of 30 men and, threading their way through the wilderness, at length reached the springs unassailed. It was one of the boldest of adventures. It was certain that the watchful Indians would learn that a party had left the cover of the fort and would fall upon them with great ferocity. Colonel Boone, who desired to obtain salt for all the garrisons, deemed it consequently necessary to work night and day with the greatest possible diligence. They could never venture to move a step beyond the grasp of their rifles. For nearly 4 weeks the salt makers pursued their work unassailed. The news of so strong and well-armed a party having left the fort reached the ears of the Indians. They had a very great dread of Boone, and knew very well he would not be found sleeping or unprotected at the springs. They shrewdly inferred that the departure of so many men must greatly weaken the garrison, and that they could never hope for a more favorable opportunity to attack Boonesborough. This formidable fortress was the great object of their dread. They thought that if they could lay it in ashes, making it the funeral pyre of all its inmates, the weaker forts would be immediately abandoned by their garrisons in despair or could easily be captured. An expedition was formed, consisting of more than 100 Indian warriors and accompanied, it is said, by 2 Frenchmen. Boone had sent 3 men back to the garrison, loaded with salt, and to convey tidings of the good condition of the party at the springs. On the morning of the 7th of February, Boone, who was unequaled in his skill as a hunter and also in the sagacity by which he could avoid the Indians, was out in search of game as food for the party. Emboldened by the absence of all signs of the vicinity of the Indians, he had wandered some distance from the springs, where he encountered this band of warriors, attended by the 2 Frenchmen, on the march for the assault on Boonesborough. Though exceedingly fleet of foot, his attempt to escape was in vain. The young Indian runners overtook and captured him. The Indians seem to have had great respect for Boone. Even with them he had acquired the reputation of being a just and humane man, while his extraordinary abilities both as a hunter and a warrior had won their admiration. Boone was not heading a war party to assail them. He had not robbed them of any of their horses. They were therefore not exasperated against him personally. It is also not improbable that the Frenchmen who were with them had influenced them not to treat their prisoner with barbarity. Boone, whose spirit seemed never to be perturbed, yielded so gracefully to his captors as to awaken in their bosoms some emotions of kindness. They promised that if the party at the springs would yield without resistance, which resistance, though unavailing, they knew would cost them the lives of many of their warriors, the lives of the captives should be safe, and they should not be exposed to any inhuman treatment. Boone was much perplexed. Had he been with his men, he would have fought to the last extremity, and his presence not improbably might have inspirited them, even to a successful defense. But deprived of their leader, taken entirely by surprise, and outnumbered 3 or 4 to 1, their massacre was certain. And it was also certain that the Indians, exasperated by the loss which they would have encountered, would put every prisoner to death, through all the horrors of fiend-like torture. Under these circumstances, Colonel Boone very wisely decided upon surrender. It would have been very impolitic and cruel to do otherwise. He having thus given his word, the Indians placed implicit confidence in it. They were also perfectly faithful to their own promises. Boone was allowed to approach his men and represent the necessity of a surrender, which was immediately effected. The Indians were so elated by this great victory, and were so well satisfied with the result of the campaign, that instead of continuing their march for the attack of Boonesborough, they returned with their illustrious captive and his 27 companions to their headquarters on the Little Miami River. The modest, unaffected account which Boone himself gives of these transactions is worthy of record here. On the 7th of February, as I was hunting to procure meat for the company, I met a party of 102 Indians and 2 Frenchmen on their march against Boonesborough, that place being particularly the object of the enemy. They pursued and took me and brought me the 8th day to the Licks, where 27 of my party were, 3 of them having previously returned home with the salt. I, knowing it was impossible for them to escape, capitulated with the enemy, and at a distance, in their view, gave notice to my men of their situation with orders not to resist, but surrender themselves captives. The generous usage the Indians had promised before in my capitulation was afterwards fully complied with, and we proceeded with them as prisoners to Old Chillicothe, the principal Indian town on Little Miami, where we arrived, after an uncomfortable journey in very severe weather on the 18th of February, and received as good treatment as prisoners could expect from savages. On the 10th of March following, I and 10 of my men were conducted by 40 Indians to Detroit, where we arrived the 30th day, and were treated by Governor Hamilton, the British commander at that post, with great humanity. During our travels, the Indians entertained me well, and their affection for me was so great that they utterly refused to leave me there with the others, although the governor offered them £100 sterling for me, on purpose to give me a parole to go home. Several English gentlemen there, being sensible of my adverse fortune, and touched with human sympathy, generously offered a friendly supply for my wants, which I refused with many thanks for their kindness, adding that I never expected it would be in my power to recompense such unmerited generosity. The British officers in Detroit could not venture to interfere in behalf of Colonel Boone in any way which would displease their savage allies, for they relied much upon them in their warfare against the colonies. There was much in the character of our hero to win the affection of the savages. His silent, unboastful courage they admired. He was more than their equal in his skill in traversing the pathless forest. His prowess as a hunter they fully appreciated. It was their hope that he would consent to be incorporated in their tribe, and they would gladly have accepted him as one of their chiefs. The savages had almost universally sufficient intelligence to appreciate the vast superiority of the white man. The Indians spent 10 days at Detroit and surrendered for a ransom all their captives to the English, excepting Colonel Boone. Him they took back on a long and fatiguing journey to Old Chillicothe on the Little Miami. The country they traversed, now so full of wealth, activity, and all the resources of individual and social happiness, was then a vast wilderness, silent and lonely. Still in its solitude it was very beautiful, embellished with fertile plains, magnificent groves, and crystal streams. At Chillicothe, Colonel Boone was formally adopted, according to an Indian custom, into the family of Blackfish, one of the distinguished chiefs of the Shawanese tribe. At Chillicothe, writes Boone, I spent my time as comfortably as I could expect. I was adopted according to their custom, into a family where I became a son, and had a great share in the affection of my new parents, brothers, sisters, and friends. I was exceedingly familiar and friendly with them, always appearing as cheerful and satisfied as possible, and they put great confidence in me. I often went hunting with them and frequently gained their applause for my activity at our shooting matches. I was careful not to excel them when shooting, for no people are more envious than they in their sport. I could observe in their countenances and gestures the greatest expressions of joy when they exceeded me, and when the reverse happened, of envy. The Shawanese king took great notice of me and treated me with profound respect and entire friendship, often trusting me to hunt at my liberty. I frequently returned with the spoils of the woods, and as often presented some of what I had taken to him, expressive of my duty to my sovereign. My food and lodging were in common with them, not so good indeed as I could desire, but necessity makes everything acceptable. The spirit manifested by Boone under these circumstances, when he was apparently a hopeless prisoner in the hands of the Indians, was not influenced by artifice alone. He had real sympathy for the savages, being fully conscious of the wrongs which were often inflicted upon them, and which goaded their untamed natures to fearful barbarities. He had always treated them not only kindly but with fraternal respect. The generous treatment he had received in return won his regards. His peculiarly placid nature was not easily disturbed by any reverses. Let what would happen, he never allowed himself to complain or to worry. Thus making the best of circumstances, he always looked upon the brightest side of things and was reasonably happy, even in this direful captivity. Still, he could not forget his home, and was continually on the alert to avail himself of whatever opportunity might be presented to escape and return to his friends. The ceremony of adoption was pretty severe and painful. All the hair of the head was plucked out by a tedious operation, leaving simply a tuft 3 or 4 inches in diameter on the crown. This was called the scalp lock. The hair was here allowed to grow long and was dressed with ribbons and feathers. It was to an individual warrior what the banner is to an army. The victor tore it from the skull as his trophy. Having thus denuded the head and dressed the scalp lock, the candidate was taken to the river and very thoroughly scrubbed, that all the white blood might be washed out of him. His face was painted in the most approved style of Indian taste, when he was led to the council lodge and addressed by the chief in a long and formal speech, in which he expatiates upon the honor conferred upon the adopted son and upon the corresponding duties expected of him. Colonel Boone, having passed through this transformation with his Indian dress and his painted cheeks, his tufted scalplock and his whole person embrowned by constant exposure to the open air, could scarcely be distinguished from any of his Indian associates. His wary captors, however, notwithstanding all the kindness with which they treated him, seemed to be conscious that it must be his desire to return to his friends. They therefore habitually, but without a remark suggestive of any suspicions, adopted precautions to prevent his escape. So skillful a hunter as Boone could, with his rifle and a supply of ammunition, traverse the solitary expanse around for almost any length of time, living in abundance. But deprived of his rifle or of ammunition, he would soon almost inevitably perish of starvation. The Indians were therefore very careful not to allow him to accumulate any ammunition, which was so essential to sustain him in a journey through the wilderness. Though Boone was often allowed to go out alone to hunt, they always counted his balls and the charges of powder. Thus they could judge whether he had concealed any ammunition to aid him should he attempt to escape. He, however, with equal sagacity, cut the balls in halves and used very small charges of powder. Thus he secretly laid aside quite a little store of ammunition. As ever undismayed by misfortune, he serenely gave the energies of his mind to the careful survey of the country around. During the time that I hunted for them, he writes, I found the land for a great extent about this river to exceed the soil of Kentucky if possible and remarkably well watered. Upon one of the branches of the Scioto River, which stream runs about 60 miles east of the Little Miami, there were some salt springs. Early in June, a party of the Indians set out for these licks to make salt. They took Boone with them. The Indians were quite averse to anything like hard work. Boone not only understood the process of manufacture perfectly, but was always quietly and energetically devoted to whatever he undertook. The Indians, inspired by the double motive of the desire to obtain as much salt as possible and to hold securely the prisoner, whom they so highly valued, kept him so busy at the kettles as to give him no opportunity to escape. After an absence of about a fortnight, they returned with a good supply of salt to the Little Miami. Here Boone was quite alarmed to find that during his absence the chiefs had been marshalling a band of 450 of their bravest warriors to attack Boonesborough. In that fort were his wife and his children. Its capture would probably ensure their slaughter. He was aware that the fort was not sufficiently guarded by its present inmates, and that, unapprehensive of impending danger, they were liable to be taken entirely by surprise. Boone was sufficiently acquainted with the Shawanese dialect to understand every word they said, while he very sagaciously had assumed from the moment of his captivity that he was entirely ignorant of their language. Boone's anxiety was very great. He was compelled to assume a smiling face as he attended their war dances. Apparently unmoved, he listened to the details of their plans for the surprise of the fort. Indeed, to disarm suspicion and to convince them that he had truly become one of their number, he cooperated in giving efficiency to their hostile designs against all he held most dear in the world. It had now become a matter of infinite moment that he should immediately escape and carry to his friends in the fort the tidings of their peril. But the slightest unwary movement would have led the suspicious Indians so to redouble their vigilance as to render escape utterly impossible. So skillfully did he conceal the emotions which agitated him, and so successfully did he feign entire contentment with his lot, that his captors, all absorbed in the enterprise in which they were engaged, remitted their ordinary vigilance. On the morning of the 16th of June, Boone rose very early to take his usual hunt. With his secreted ammunition and the amount allowed him by the Indians for the day, he hoped to be able to save himself from starvation during his flight of 5 days through the pathless wilderness. There was a distance of 160 miles between Old Chillicothe and Boonesborough. The moment his flight should be suspected, 450 Indian warriors, breathing vengeance and in perfect preparation for the pursuit, would be on his track. His capture would almost certainly result in his death by the most cruel tortures, for the infuriated Indians would wreak upon him all their vengeance. It is, however, not probable that this silent, pensive man allowed these thoughts seriously to disturb his equanimity. An instinctive trust in God seemed to inspire him. He was 43 years of age. In the knowledge of woodcraft and in powers of endurance, no Indian surpassed him. Though he would be pursued by sagacious and veteran warriors and by young Indian braves, a pack of 450 savages following with keener scent than that of the bloodhound, one poor victim, yet undismayed, he entered upon the appalling enterprise. The history of the world perhaps presents but few feats so difficult, and yet so successfully performed. And yet the only record which this modest man makes in his autobiography of this wonderful adventure is as follows. On the 16th before sunrise I departed in the most secret manner and arrived at Boonesborough on the 20th after a journey of 160 miles during which I had but one meal. It was necessary, as soon as Boone got out of sight of the village, to fly with the utmost speed to put as great a distance as possible between himself and his pursuers, before they should suspect his attempt at escape. He subsequently learned that as soon as the Indians apprehended that he had actually fled, there was the most intense commotion in their camp, and immediately a large number of their fleetest runners and keenest hunters were put upon his trail. He dared not fire a gun. Had he killed any game, he could not have ventured to kindle a fire to cook it. He had secretly provided himself with a few cuts of dried venison with which he could appease his hunger as he pressed forward by day and by night, scarcely allowing himself one moment for rest or sleep. His route lay through forests and swamps and across many streams swollen by recent rains. At length he reached the Ohio River. Its current was swift and turbid, rolling in a majestic flood half a mile in width, filling the bed of the stream with almost fathomless waters from shore to shore. Experienced as Colonel Boone was in woodcraft, he was not a skillful swimmer. The thought of how he should cross the Ohio had caused him much anxiety. Upon reaching its banks he fortunately, may we not say providentially, found an old canoe which had drifted among the bushes upon the shore. There was a large hole at one end and it was nearly filled with water. He succeeded in bailing out the water and plugging up the hole and crossed the river in safety. Then for the first time he so far indulged in a feeling of security as to venture to shoot a turkey, and kindling a fire he feasted abundantly upon the rich repast. It was the only meal in which he indulged during his flight of 5 days. On his arrival at Boonesborough, he was welcomed as one risen from the grave. Much to his disappointment, he found that his wife with his children, despairing of ever seeing him again, had left the fort and returned to the house of her father in North Carolina. She supposed that the Indians had killed him. Oppressed, writes Boone, with the distresses of the country and bereaved of me, her only happiness, she had undertaken her long and perilous journey through the wilderness. It is gratifying to record that she reached her friends in safety. Boone found the fort as he had apprehended, in a bad state of defense. His presence, his military skill, and the intelligence he brought immediately inspired every man to the intensest exertion. The gates were strengthened, new bastions were formed, and provisions were laid in to stand a siege. Everything was done which could be done to repel an assault from they knew not how many savages, aided by British leaders, for the band from Old Chillicothe was to be joined by warriors from several other tribes. In 10 days, Boonesborough was ready for the onset. These arduous labors being completed, Boone heroically resolved to strike consternation into the Indians by showing them that he was prepared for aggressive as well as defensive warfare, and that they must leave behind them warriors for the protection of their own villages. Selecting a small party of but 19 men, about the 1st of August he emerged from Boonesborough, marched boldly to the Ohio, crossed the river, entered the valley of the Scioto, and was within 4 miles of an Indian town, Paint Creek, which he intended to destroy, when he chanced to encounter a band of 30 savages painted, thoroughly armed and on the warpath, to join the band advancing from Old Chillicothe. The Indians were attacked with such vehemence by Boone that they fled in consternation, leaving behind them 3 horses and all their baggage. The savages also lost 1 killed and 2 wounded, while they inflicted no loss whatever upon the white men. Boone sent forward some swift runners as spies, and they speedily returned with the report that the Indians in a panic had entirely abandoned Paint Creek. Aware that the warriors would rush to join the 450 from Old Chillicothe, and that they might cut off his retreat or reach Boonesborough before his return, he immediately commenced a rapid movement back to the fort. Every man would be needed there for an obstinate defense. This foray had extended 150 miles from the fort. It greatly alarmed the Indians. It emboldened the hearts of the garrison and gave them intelligence of the approach of their foes. After an absence of but 7 days, Boone with his heroic little band quite triumphantly re-entered the fort. The approach of the foe is described in the following terms by Boone. On the 8th of August, the Indian army arrived, being 444 in number, commanded by Captain Duquesne, 11 other Frenchmen and some of their own chiefs, and marched up in view of our fort with British and French colors flying. And having sent a summons to me in His Britannic Majesty's name to surrender the fort, I requested 2 days' consideration, which was granted. It was now a critical period with us. We were a small number in the garrison, a powerful army before our walls whose appearance proclaimed inevitable death, fearfully painted and marking their footsteps with desolation. Death was preferable to captivity, and if taken by storm, we must inevitably be devoted to destruction. In this situation, we concluded to maintain our garrison if possible. We immediately proceeded to collect what we could of our horses and other cattle and bring them through the posterns into the fort, and in the evening of the 9th I returned the answer that we were determined to defend our fort while a man was living. Now, said I to their commander, who stood attentively hearing my sentiments, We laugh at your formidable preparations, but thank you for giving us notice and time for our defense. Your efforts will not prevail, for our gates shall forever deny you admittance. Whether this answer affected their courage or not, I cannot tell, but contrary to our expectations, they formed a scheme to deceive us, declaring it was their orders from Governor Hamilton to take us captives and not to destroy us. But if 9 of us would come out and treat with them, they would immediately withdraw their forces from our walls and return home peaceably. This sounded grateful in our ears, and we agreed to the proposal. Victories and defeats. Situation of the Fort Indian treachery bombardment. Boone goes to North Carolina. New trials. Boone robbed. He returns to Kentucky. Massacre of Call. Rogers' adventure of Call Bowman. New attack by the British and Indians. Retaliatory measures. Wonderful exploit. There were but 50 men in the garrison at Boonesborough. They were assailed by a body of more than 10 to 1 of the bravest Indian warriors, under the command of an officer in the British Army. The boldest in the fort felt that their situation was almost desperate. The ferocity of the Indian and the intelligence of the white man were combined against them. They knew that the British commander, however humane he might be, would have no power, should the fort be taken by storm, to save them from death by the most horrible tortures. General Duquesne was acting under instructions from Governor Hamilton, the British officer in supreme command at Detroit. Boone knew that the governor felt very kindly towards him. When he had been carried to that place a captive, the governor had made very earnest endeavors to obtain his liberation. Influenced by these considerations, he consented to hold the conference. But better acquainted with the Indian character than perhaps Duquesne could have been, he selected 9 of the most athletic and strong of the garrison, and appointed the place of meeting in front of the fort, at a distance of only 120 feet from the walls. The riflemen of the garrison were placed in a position to cover the spot with their guns, so that in case of treachery the Indians would meet with instant punishment, and the retreat of the party from the fort would probably be secured. The language of Boone is, "We held a treaty within 60 yards of the garrison on purpose to divert them from a breach of honor, as we could not avoid suspicion of the savages." The terms proposed by General Duquesne were extremely liberal. And while they might satisfy the British party, whose object in the war was simply to conquer the colonists and bring them back to loyalty, they could by no means have satisfied the Indians, who desired not merely to drive the white men back from their hunting grounds, but to plunder them of their possessions and to gratify their savage natures by hearing the shrieks of their victims at the stake, and by carrying home the trophies of numerous scalps. Boone and his men, buried in the depths of the wilderness, had probably taken little interest in the controversy which was just then rising between the colonies and the mother country. They had regarded the King of England as their lawful sovereign, and their minds had never been agitated by the question of revolution or of independence. When therefore General Duquesne proposed that they should take the oath of allegiance to the King of Great Britain, and that then they should be permitted to return unmolested to their homes and their friends beyond the mountains, taking all their possessions with them, Colonel Boone and his associates were very ready to accept such terms. It justly appeared to them in their isolated condition, 500 miles away from the Atlantic coast, that this was vastly preferable to remaining in the wilderness assailed by thousands of Indians guided by English energy and abundantly provided with all the munitions of war from British arsenals. But Boone knew very well that the Indians would never willingly assent to this treaty. Still he and his fellow commissioners signed it while very curious to learn how it would be regarded by their savage foes. The commissioners on both sides had appeared at the appointed place of conference, as is usual on such occasions, entirely unarmed. There were, however, a large number of Indians lingering around and drawing nearer as the conference proceeded. After the treaty was signed, the old Indian chief Blackfish, Boone's adopted father, and who, exasperated by the escape of his ungrateful son, had been watching him with a very unamiable expression of countenance, arose and made a formal speech in the most approved style of Indian eloquence. He commented upon the bravery of the two armies, and of the desirableness that there should be entire friendship between them, and closed by saying that it was a custom with them on all such important occasions to ratify the treaty by two Indians shaking hands with each white man. This shallow pretense, scarcely up to the sagacity of children, by which Blackfish hoped that two savages grappling each one of the commissioners would easily be able to make prisoners of them, and then by threats of torture compel the surrender of the fort, did not in the slightest degree deceive Colonel Boone. He was well aware of his own strength and of that of the men who accompanied him. He also knew that his riflemen occupied concealed positions from which with unerring aim they could instantly punish the savages for any act of treachery. He therefore consented to the arrangement. The grasp was given. Instantly, a terrible scene of confusion ensued. The burly savages tried to drag off their victims. The surrounding Indians rushed in to their aid, and a deadly fire was opened upon them from the fort, which was energetically responded to by all the armed savages from behind stumps and trees. One of the fiercest of battles had instantly blazed forth. Still, these stalwart pioneers were not taken by surprise. Aided by the bullets of the fort, they shook off their assailants, and all succeeded in escaping within the heavy gates which were immediately closed behind them. One only of their number, Boone's brother, was wounded. This escape seems almost miraculous. But the majority of the Indians in intelligence were mere children, sometimes very cunning but often with the grossest stupidity mingled with their strategy. Duquesne and Blackfish, the associated leaders, now commenced the siege of the fort with all their energies. Dividing their forces into two parties, they kept up an incessant fire upon the garrison for 9 days and 9 nights. It was one of the most heroic of those bloody struggles between civilization and barbarism, which have rendered the plains of Kentucky memorable. The savages were very careful not to expose themselves to the rifles of the besieged. They were stationed behind rocks and trees and stumps, so that it was seldom that the garrison could catch even a glimpse of the foes who were assailing them. It was necessary for those within the fort to be sparing of their ammunition. They seldom fired unless they could take deliberate aim, and then the bullet was almost always sure to reach its mark. Colonel Boone, in describing this attempt of the Indians to capture the commissioners by stratagem and of the storm of war which followed, writes, "They immediately grappled us, but although surrounded by hundreds of savages, we extricated ourselves from them and escaped all safe into the garrison except one, who was wounded through a heavy fire from their army. They immediately attacked us on every side, and a constant heavy fire ensued between us day and night for the space of 9 days. In this time the enemy began to undermine our fort, which was situated about 60 yards from the Kentucky River. They began at the watermark and proceeded in the bank some distance, which we understood by their making the water muddy with the clay. We immediately proceeded to disappoint their design by cutting a trench across their subterranean passage. The enemy, discovering our counter-mine by the clay we threw out of the fort, desisted from that stratagem. Experience now fully convincing them that neither their power nor their policy could effect their purpose. On the 20th of August they raised the siege and departed. During this siege, which threatened death in every form, we had 2 men killed and 4 wounded, besides a number of cattle. We killed of the enemy 37 and wounded a great number. After they were gone, we picked up 125 pounds weight of bullets, besides what stuck in the logs of our fort, which certainly is a great proof of their industry. It is said that during this siege, one of the Negroes, probably a slave, deserted from the fort with one of their best rifles and joined the Indians. Concealing himself in a tree, where unseen he could take deliberate aim, he became one of the most successful of the assailants. But the eagle eye of Boone detected him, and though, as was afterwards ascertained by actual measurement, the tree was 525 feet distant from the fort, Boone took deliberate aim, fired, and the man was seen to drop heavily from his covert to the ground. The bullet from Boone's rifle had pierced his brain. At one time the Indians had succeeded in setting fire to the fort by throwing flaming combustibles upon it attached to their arrows. One of the young men extinguished the flames, exposing himself to the concentrated and deadly fire of the assailants in doing so. Though the bullets fell like hailstones around him, the brave fellow escaped unscathed. This repulse quite disheartened the Indians. Henceforth they regarded Boonesborough as a Gibraltar, impregnable to any force which they could bring against it. They never assailed it again. Though Boonesborough is now but a small village in Kentucky, it has a history which will render it forever memorable in the annals of heroism. It will be remembered that Boone's family, supposing him to have perished by the hands of the Indians, had returned to the home of Mrs. Boone's father in North Carolina. Colonel Boone, anxious to rejoin his wife and children, and feeling that Boonesborough was safe from any immediate attack by the Indians, soon after the dispersion of the savages entered again upon the long journey through the wilderness to find his friends east of the mountains. In the autumn of 1778, Colonel Boone again found himself, after all his wonderful adventures, in a peaceful home on the banks of the Yadkin. The settlements in Kentucky continued rapidly to increase. The savages had apparently relinquished all hope of holding exclusive possession of the country. Though there were occasional acts of violence and cruelty, there was quite a truce in the Indian warfare. But the white settlers and those who wished to emigrate were greatly embarrassed by conflicting land claims. Many of the pioneers found their titles pronounced to be of no validity. Others who wished to emigrate experienced great difficulty in obtaining secure possession of their lands. The reputation of Kentucky as in all respects one of the most desirable of earthly regions for comfortable homes, added to the desire of many families to escape from the horrors of Revolutionary War, which was sweeping the seaboard, led to a constant tide of emigration beyond the mountains. Under these circumstances, the government of Virginia established a court, consisting of 4 prominent citizens to go from place to place, examine such titles as should be presented to them, and to confirm those which were good. This commission commenced its duties at St. Asaph. All the old terms of settlement proposed by Henderson and the Transylvania Company were abrogated. Thus Colonel Boone had no title to a single acre of land in Kentucky. A new law, however, was enacted as follows.